Today is Wednesday, the 7th of April, 2021. My name is Chris Cho. I'm interviewing Patricia Gonzalez for the Voces Oral History Center at the University of Texas at Austin. Please know, Patricia, that this recorded interview will be placed in the Nettie Lee Benson Latin American Collection at the University of Texas at Austin and the Brown University's Library Digital Repository. If there is anything you do not wish to answer or talk about, I will honor your wishes. Also, if there is a topic that you want to talk about, please bring it up and we can discuss it. Participation in the study is completely voluntary, and you are free to withdraw from the interview at any time. Because we are not conducting this interview in person, I need to record you consenting to participate in this interview. I will ask you a series of 5 questions. Please say, yes, I agree, or no, I do not agree after each one. Voces of a Pandemic wishes to archive your interview along with any other photographs and other documentation that you wish to contribute at the Benson Library at UT Austin and Brown University's Digital Repository. The Voces Oral History Project will retain copyright of the interview and any other materials that you choose to donate. First question, do you give the Voces of the Pandemic Project consent to archive your interview and your materials at the Benson Library and Brown University Library Digital Repository?
Yes.
Do you grant the Voices of a Pandemic Project copyright over the interview and any material that you choose to provide?
Yes.
Do you agree to allow Voices of a Pandemic to post this interview on the internet via the Voces Oral History Center's YouTube channel, where it may be viewed by the public?
Yes, I agree.
We have many questions in a pre-interview form that we have already filled out. We use that information from the pre-interview form to help in research. The entire form is kept in a secure server at the University of Texas, Austin. Before we send your information from the pre-interview form to the Benson Library, we would have stripped out any contact information for yourself or family members so that will not be part of your public file. Your public file will only be accessible at the Benson Library. Do you wish for us to share the rest of your interview in your public file to researchers at the Benson Library?
Yes.
On occasion, the Voces Oral History Center receives requests from journalists who wish to contact individuals who have participated as narrators in oral history interviews. The Voces Oral History Center only responds to reputable news outlets. Do you give consent for Voces to share your phone number, or email with journalists that are interested in your story?
Yes.
So is that a yes?
Yes.
Okay. Thank you very much for answering these questions. And let's hop into some of these oral history questions. So tell me a little bit about yourself, who you are, where you're from, and what you do.
So I'm from Brooklyn, New York, so New York City. My family is from Puerto Rico. I was the only person in my family born in the United States on the mainland. Right now I work for the Jack Kent Cooke Foundation. It's a scholarship organization that's a private foundation, also a nonprofit. And what we do is we provide scholarship funding, but also support and advising to scholars who come from various diverse backgrounds, who have great academics and may experience some financial need.
Great. So why did you decide to become an educator, and what fuels your passion for education?
That's really good question. So I attended college pretty much first gen. So I have older siblings. My siblings all attended City University in New York. I decided as the youngest that I wanted to go away to college. But generally first gen, went away to Syracuse University for undergrad. And I learned a lot being part of cultural organizations, helped to found cultural organizations on campus as soon as I got there. And um, what I learned was that I didn't know anything about my culture, and I didn't know anything about any other culture other than that of um, white people. So it's very Eurocentric culture. And you know, we just didn't learn about anything. And what I realized is that that really impacted my self-efficacy, my ideas about success and what I could do and how I could succeed. And so I learned a lot in terms of in the classroom, but also outside of the classroom, just a lot of reading, you know, about Latin American history, about African American history, taking classes there. And what I realized pretty much halfway through was that I wanted to teach because I wanted to make sure that the curriculum that students who look like me included them. And you know, one thing we always talked about in college was I was very much an activist in college. And one thing we used to talk about a lot was the revolution, right? Like, how are we going to have the revolution? And I just remember saying my way of being part of the revolution is to impact the people who come after me and to change their minds about themselves, where they come from, and just change the narrative that society has for us. And that's what inspired me to become an educator.
Wow. So I think a lot of those I feel like have informed at least the ways that I've experienced advising on this side of the advising table. But how has your like prior experience, and how does that factor into the ways that you approach advising students?
So I think I've always been very student centered in every role that I've had as an educator. So, you know, I've been a counselor, I've been a teacher, an academic advisor. Um, in in every role I've tried to be student centered. And so one thing that I always do is I think about how much my identity development impacted me while I was in college. And it's, you know, it was a long time ago, but I feel like I can relate to my scholars' experiences and with the students that I've advised over the years, hearing their experiences as, you know, myself being a low income Latina, you know, Puerto Rican from a city who lived in, who grew up in poverty, like um, there's so many things that I could relate to. And so I work through the lens of empathy and sort of like putting myself in my scholar's shoes as best I can to help them to understand that I do um you know, I can relate to what they're experiencing. And you know, and I hope I would say that I want to be the person that I wish I had when I was growing up. And so that's a big thing that happens for me in the advising relationship.
It's amazing. So I think in your advising time, you've also been an advisor through the COVID-19 pandemic. So how and when did you first hear about COVID-19? What were your reactions and the reactions of those around you?
So I actually funny story. One of my former students was in China in January. And because I keep in touch with my students and you know, on social media, I noticed that a lot of her stories on Instagram were coming from being in quarantine. So I was like, what is happening? Right. This was back in January of 2020. I had been traveling. So, at that point in time, I had been in Puerto Rico for a couple of days. And then I was planning on traveling in February to California. And I do remember having that was a work travel. So I was going to visit some scholars. And I do remember having the thought, should I cancel my trip? And I didn't, because I felt like I was going to see a large number of scholars. And I just felt like I needed to do that. And so it was sort of at that point in time pretty important for me to make that trip, not knowing that it was going to be my last trip for a while. And that was mid-February actually. And so I'm trying to think, like, I think at that point I was a little nervous because people were coming in from international flights into LAX, which I was flying in and out of LAX. But I could not imagine that this would be what it turned out to be.
That is this sentence that sums up pretty much all of this. But so, how did your experiences in COVID-19? I think like when it's first really started hitting the states and where your scholars are. What was the transition like for you in adjusting how to advise remotely, and also like the issues that you had to advise on?
So actually, I think right before we all were sent home to work remotely, uh, probably either a week before or the week of, I had a scholar who was studying abroad in Italy. And we were trying to figure out what we could do to get her home because things had been getting pretty bad in Italy. And so um, I think that was my first experience with sort of like the anxiety of figuring out what COVID was going to do and how COVID was going to impact my scholars. Um, so that happened probably right in the beginning of March. And then we had a few days. Um, remember, we got sent home on March 12th. And so we had a few days before that where we were kind of trying to figure out what is going to happen. But the transition in and of itself was hard. It was really hard for several reasons. And I think mostly because a lot of scholars were uprooted from different places. So whether they were on spring break and had to go home and couldn't go back to campus and get their stuff, or they were on campus and housing insecure and not able to stay on campus. There were, I mean, so many scholars have so many different lived experiences. And so trying to navigate for each scholar what this impact was going to be while making the transition to working remotely, completely remotely, I think I will say, looking back at it, there was um, just jumping into action, contacting scholars, like what do you need? How can we help you? What are schools doing? Trying to figure out how our scholars campuses were supporting them. If we had to book flights, emergency flights home, trying to communicate that. So it was hard. And I think part of it is like, because we work with students all over the country, just trying to figure out how to get people into a stable place. We all know that responsibility, like for me, that responsibility never fell primarily to me. but in some cases, I had to make sure that the scholar knew what they were going to do. The other part of that was that I don't think a lot of my students really understood what was happening. And it was really strange because then we were talking about summer. What am I gonna do this summer? And I was like, I think we're not gonna have the same summer. And in my mind, I was like, are we gonna be around this summer? I don't know. So it was really it was strange because I was going between like crisis solving mode to let's talk about normal things. And that was a lot. That was kind of a lot. When I look back at it, I'm like, how did we do this?
Definitely, I can barely remember what happened then, but I remember just like feeling very anxious. But wonderful job. So I think what's also like kind of alluded to are like the different like issues thinking about like housing and like plans that scholars needed to have after schools were dispersed. Um, I think how has COVID especially affected your work with scholars um, that are affected like due to immigration status, being low income, being Latinx or other people of color? Um, yeah.
So I think here is where things were really I think things were so different. Like there wasn't anything in common necessarily that scholars had. um there wasn't a common experience. Everything was very individualized. I think one of the things that came later on, when it came to scholars with like varying immigration status, was not being able to get a COVID test for free, not being able to, not being able to get it because, and for low income scholars, just if you didn't have health insurance, how would you pay for the test? So, and I think for some scholars, and their families, being an essential worker, or being in a position where you have to go to work, but now you can't get a COVID test. There's a lot of, I think, not being able to ask for help in the ways that a lot of American citizens, like US citizens, were able to ask or access help. And so one of the things that we attempted to do, and I would say advisors were really instrumental in saying, like, figuring out what do our scholars need, and really having individual conversations and asking our scholars, what do you need? And documenting those needs so that we could have an emergency fund that scholars could request. And so, especially as they were kind of going into the summer and not getting support from their schools necessarily, we had to try to find a way to mitigate some of the financial stress that COVID brought for the populations that we work with.
Mm. Um, I think also on the other side of that is the university response. And so what are ways that you've seen that kind of happen in ways that you as an advisor have had to kind of work with the ways that schools have either provided support or not?
So, we have scholars at great schools, right? And a lot of those schools are private universities who have large endowments, who figure out how they can provide support for our first gen students or low income students. But then we have other schools where, I don't, think that they necessarily thought outside of the box. And so, you know, when I think about, for example, one of the things that our scholarship helps scholars with is housing. And so room and board, right? Some universities didn't even, like, they just refunded room and board to the scholar, which is great. Some universities reached out to us and said, where do we send the refund to you? So, you know, they were gonna send a refund to the scholarship organization rather than to the scholar. And so part of what we said was, well, we don't need the money, the scholar needs the money. So please send the money to the scholar. And we had to do that with a few schools. And I think, you know, depending on, you know, the college or university and what they have in terms of resources and funding that's available to them, probably dictated how much they could help the scholars. And so some schools took money from the government through the CARES Act, which they were able to earmark for scholars who had financial need. Some of them that came along with except for, right? So there were exceptions. So if someone is undocumented, they should not be receiving this government funding. And so some of the universities actually were like, you know what, we're not going to take your funding because we're not working with those exceptions. And I really credit those universities who decided to do that. But you know, other ones needed that money, right? And so they had to use it the way that it was, you know, how it was dictated to them to utilize that funding.
Um, and hopping to just like how many different cases of experiences that scholars had during the pandemic and different ways that schools have responded, and just like so many different variables all over the place. How has this posed a challenge for your role as an advisor? Have you handled that?
It's my role has expanded a lot. So I feel like more, you know, I feel like I'm using my counseling degree a lot more than I have in the past. I do feel like I have to go into like problem solving mode more than I have in the past. Whereas, like, I think as an advisor, generally I try to work as a guide and help my scholars come to conclusions on their own. But when people are experiencing high anxiety, it's not a good time to brainstorm solutions. Sometimes it's a matter of trying to figure out how to solve the problem. So that definitely, you know, I would say, especially because a lot of scholars were isolated during the pandemic, I got a lot of this is good, I guess, you know, but I got a lot of I really want to talk with you because you're not in my family. Like, you're like one person who I don't see or speak with every day. So let's talk, you know. And so I will say that since the pandemic, my calls have been more frequent and definitely go longer because there's a lot that scholars are going through, and the isolation, you know, it triggers a lot of whether it's anxiety, whether it's depression, and there's so much that we all have experienced during this time that is new to all of us. And so trying to figure out, like, how do you manage this, whatever this is.
Mm,
Yeah.
I think it's a very true point. I think along those lines, like um, have you gotten new scholars this year?
Not yet, we will.
Oh, I mean, I guess last year for the 2020-2021 school year.
I did. We transitioned a little bit in terms of our model. And so I have not worked with transfer scholars previously. And so I do have transfer scholars, and that's a different set of skills that you need to use. And I think, just thinking about people's different life experiences, and so that was a little bit of a learning curve, but people are people, right? And so you just adjust and you work with people no matter where they come from and what their experiences are.
Yeah, how have you, I guess, what sort of skills have you been uh, trying to target? And then also, how has the transition um, been for transfer scholars? Has it been different, or because of like building community or whatnot? Um, how has that experience been?
So, one thing, when you're working with pretty much traditional college scholars, generally a lot of the scholars went home to families. Transfer scholars come from different experiences. So some of them have actually, their families are abroad, and so they came to the United States for school. And so going into there wasn't necessarily a safe space, or they're not traditional college age students, so helping them navigate things where they don't necessarily have the support of another like family member or someone else, a spouse or so, um I think financially there is a lot more at stake with that particular population. And then the transition into college, right? Like the transition from a community college to a 4-year school during a pandemic was very isolating for a lot of those students. And so, and it's, I mean, it was isolating for everybody, but I think my experience has been that it was a lot, like really isolating for some of my transfer scholars. And so I think one of the things that I try to do is make sure to connect them with each other, um, do a couple of connections by campus or by region so that they could keep in touch with each other virtually. Um, and lots of check-ins, lots of check-ins.
It's very true. Um, Always appreciate check-ins. Um, I think on just like a broader scale, especially considering your background in all sorts of places in education, um, how has COVID-19 changed education or revealed about it? Um, and how have you related to that?
Um, so we all know that there are disparities, right? We know that, and we know that those disparities have existed. The pandemic has revealed how all institutions fail the students who need them most, or the people who need them most, right? When we think about who made the most money during a pandemic, it was less than 10 people in this entire country, right? And that applies also to institutions, and then that applies to the people who are part of those institutions. And I think that as we sort of, I mean, now that we're over a year into this, what lessons have we learned? I mean, I think, with higher education, um, not testing, prospective applicants, is a good thing, and I think that has been helpful for some students to feel like, okay, now I can apply to these colleges and universities because they're not looking at my test score, and there's other things that they can look at. But I think that higher education is struggling with how to move forward from this. Like, because if you decide, oh, we're going to go back to test scores as part of the admissions application, then you're saying we actually liked it the way that it was before, when there was more inequality in this process. And that makes it easier for us, the institution, to make the decisions we need to make. But then what about everything that you've seen and witnessed? You know, I think that there were students who were planning on going to college, but after the pandemic, they didn't, you know, and who reached out to them? Who knows where they are? Who knows how to get them back in now that they finished high school and need to go to college? You know, these are things that if people were left behind before the pandemic, they were left behind during the pandemic. And I think not just the pandemic in and of itself, but what people like to call the racial reckoning over the past year has us asking the question, like, how do we provide access? How do we stop gatekeeping? But also, you know, for all of the people who have fallen through the cracks, how do we go and find those people and give them opportunity and access and help them to help them to feel empowered to walk in those doors? So we're just, you know, I think it's a question that I'm glad that you're asking me, because I ask myself all the time, how do we change this? Like, we cannot go back to how things were. And even as I look at who's still struggling the most, the people who need the most support, whether it's financial or mental health support or health insurance or health, you know, and safety, physical safety, are not getting it. And why is that happening? Why is that happening? And so, yeah, I mean, it's huge. And sometimes the questions are overwhelming, but I think my biggest thing is we can't go back to the way things were, because it was clear that it wasn't working for a large number of people in this country.
How have you, I guess, integrated that sort of understand? I think it's a hard question to ask and to think about, especially thinking about how do we go forward. But what have you been doing so far that has been working for you? Or how do you see your role as an educational advisor being part of that scheme?
Yeah. So one of the things that I said to myself in beginning of this year, I do not do resolutions, but one thing that I said was I was going to speak my truth no matter what. And so part of my job is I think now more so than ever to think about how to push against existing policies, you know, existing procedures, to look at places where even, you know, a great organization that like provides support for people, like, where can we stretch where can we grow as an organization? And I think, when I think about certain times um, when I've had to say no to scholars, I think again, right? So like in the past where I've had to be like, no, like we don't do that. I now ask myself, why don't we do that? And does it make sense? And if it doesn't make sense, I'm going to ask. And I'm going to advocate, for us to think again, take a couple steps back and never do something because that's the way we've always done it. But to think about, like, in what areas are we actually placing a barrier? And let's remove those. So, that's where sometimes I think, in general, in anywhere you go, when you have that one person who's like, but wait, and everybody's not always like, oh, come on, yes, I love that. No, people aren't really like that. Like they don't react that way. And so in some ways, I do understand that the idea of speaking my truth is risky, but I know why I'm taking that risk, and it is because I want to make sure that people feel like I'm not putting up an unnecessary barrier between them and something that they need.
Not to hop around, but I I actually haven't heard the phrase the racial reckoning, but I think that does sound like the thing that people would name it. Um, but how have you, speaking of like access and ways in which um, uh, institutions have responded to students, how have you seen institutions and how have you responded to um, that sort of cluster of events in the way that you speak with like students of color?
So one thing that I have been doing a lot more is letting my scholars know how I feel about certain things. And um, and I do understand that everybody doesn't think the same way, doesn't believe the same, didn't vote the same way, and all those things. I do understand that, but I think that it's important for people to know that I believe that we are not free until all of us are free. And if that means that, if that means that someone, I'm going to fight for the least of us, and I'm going to fight for everyone to feel included, like included. I think I don't know how else to say it. And I think I try to do that without imposing my beliefs, but I think, core issues like empathy and compassion and, I think equality matters. I think that, people's physical lives matter, that, so I think that I have been a lot more communicative to my particular scholars that I engage with. When things happen, I make sure I send out messages. I check on people. I make sure people know that I'm thinking of them when something happens, or I think I just try to make sure I let people know that I'm thinking of them, because I think people sometimes need to just know that. Conversations with scholars, it's just been making sure that they understand that they have permission to express how they feel. And so, like, more recently, because the news has highlighted more of anti-Asian violent incidents. Um, I've just, like, for my scholars who come from Asian descended backgrounds, you know, I've just been like, I I don't know what it feels like, you know, but I'm here to listen to you, and I want you to know that I'm a safe place for you to say how you feel. And it's been really good, I think. Um, the experience that I've had is that scholars have been like, I haven't had anybody to talk with about this. And so it's just a matter of providing a space, like holding space for people. Um, and I would say it's been, as hard as things have been to talk about what's been going on, it's been going on and we can't ignore it. And I know that my relationship with my scholars has gotten so much better because of that, just holding space.
Mm. Yeah, I, incredible. The whole pandemic has been super taxing. I think politically and mentally and physically. Um, but what is while you hold space for students, how do you hold space for yourself, and what has brought you joy or hope or energy and warmth?
Some days are so good, you know, some days are so good because, um, you know, it's really kind of weird, but I'm the kind of person who, when a lot is going on, I like to make a mental list, and sometimes I write that list down. And so definitely what has it sounds weird, but like what has brought me joy is when I'm on the phone with a scholar and we don't know what's happening at the beginning of that call, but at the end of that call, we have a list, right? And the scholar has a direction and they know where to go and they know what they're going to do next. You know, so that's one thing, which is, I, you know, but, um, and I think, you know, how much my scholars mean to me. And that's a big, big, huge part of my world. Um, how I how I how I hold space for myself. I have dedicated the first 20 to 30 minutes of every day to myself. So that usually means doing some yoga, doing a little bit of meditation sometimes, uh, some form of exercise in the morning, because I never know what my day is going to bring. And so I want to make sure that the first part of my day is for myself. And, you know, I don't ever want to end the day feeling like I did not do this for myself. No. So I start with myself first. And then calling people, like being on the phone with people that, like, not related to work, right? Like, so that's not something that I had time for before, and I made time for now. Reconnecting with a lot of people that were part of my life, you know, whether it was high school or college or whatever. Um, Family Zooms are so funny and often very emotional. And I think just for me, for myself, just like giving myself a lot of grace, because I am extremely self-critical, and I also know that I cannot keep giving my scholars like good advice to take care of themselves, and then I'm not even doing it. So, it's like I have to like know what it feels like to do self-care if I'm gonna advise other people to do self-care. So it changes, but I think I definitely learned a long time ago to start my day by doing something for myself first.
Is there anything else you'd like to share that we haven't talked about?
Hmm. I can't think of anything off the top of my head.
Well, in that case, thank you very much for taking the time to be part of this oral history. And again, yeah.